I used to think that home was just a place where you kept your things, where you slept at night, where you made dinner and watched television. But home is actually much more fragile than that. Home is trust made visible in shared spaces, in photographs on mantels, in coffee cups left on nightstands, because you know someone else will understand. Home is the assumption that the person sleeping next to you wants to build something lasting together. What I learned the hard way is that some people don't see home as sacred. They see it as territory to be conquered, as a prize to be claimed, as something they can walk into and declare theirs, simply because they want it more than you're willing to fight for it. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning, everything changed, started like any other Wednesday, in Riverside, Oregon. I had been rushing around our craftsman house on Maple Street, trying to get ready for work, while Mark finished his coffee and scrolled through construction site updates on his phone. The October air was crisp enough that I could see my breath when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, and the maple trees lining our street had turned that perfect shade of gold that made me fall in love with this neighborhood 6 years ago. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found this house, how perfectly it fit our vision of building a life together. The two-story home, with its wide front porch and original hardwood floors, had been a stretch financially when we bought it 4 years ago, but Mark had assured me that his construction business was growing and that we could handle the mortgage together. I had trusted him completely, the way you trust someone when you've been married for 6 years and dated for 2 before that. That kind of trust that feels as natural as breathing, until suddenly you can't breathe at all. I was running late for a client presentation at Creative Solutions Marketing Agency, where I had been working as a marketing coordinator for the past 3 years. Jennifer Walsh, my boss, had been hinting about a promotion to senior coordinator, and this particular client pitch could make or break my chances. I grabbed my portfolio from the home office that Mark and I had set up in what used to be the 3rd bedroom, kissed him goodbye with the usual quick peck on the cheek, and told him I'd probably be home late because Amanda Rodriguez, my best friend since college, wanted to grab dinner after work to celebrate her recent nursing certification. Mark barely looked up from his phone, just mumbled something about ordering pizza for himself, which should have been my first red flag. In 6 years of marriage, Mark had never been content with just ordering pizza when I wasn't home. He was the kind of man who took pride in cooking elaborate meals, who treated our kitchen like his personal laboratory for trying new recipes he found online. But I was focused on my presentation, on the possibility of advancement, on all the ways our life seemed to be moving forward according to plan. The presentation went better than I had hoped. Our potential client, a local boutique hotel chain, seemed genuinely excited about the rebranding campaign I had developed, and Jennifer pulled me aside afterward to tell me that she was impressed with my strategic thinking and attention to detail. Amanda and I celebrated over Thai food at our favorite restaurant downtown, and she kept telling me how proud she was of how far I had come in my career, how she could see the confidence growing in me over the past year. We talked about her new position at Riverside General Hospital, about her plans to eventually become a nurse practitioner, about my dreams of maybe starting my own marketing consultancy someday. The conversation flowed the way it always did with Amanda. Easy and supportive and full of the kind of friendship that makes you feel like you can handle whatever life throws at you. I felt grateful for the stability in my life, for a husband who supported my ambitions even if he wasn't always the most communicative, for a best friend who believed in me unconditionally, for a career that was finally starting to gain momentum. I didn't get home until almost 9 o'clock, later than I had planned because Amanda and I had gotten so caught up in talking that we lost track of time. The house looked normal from the outside, warm light glowing through the windows, Mark's truck parked in our driveway next to the empty space where my car belonged. But when I walked through the front door, something felt different in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can sense the electricity building but the sky hasn't opened yet. I called out Mark's name as I hung my coat in the closet and set my purse on the small table we kept by the entrance, but he didn't respond immediately. I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, which struck me as odd because Mark hadn't mentioned having anyone over, and he usually gave me a heads up when Tony Russo, his business partner, stopped by to discuss project details. I walked toward the kitchen, already forming an apology in my mind for being later than I had said I would be. already thinking about how I would tell Mark about the successful presentation and Jennifer's positive feedback. But when I rounded the corner into our kitchen, the words died in my throat. Sitting at our kitchen island, on one of the bar stools that Mark and I had picked out together at a furniture store in Portland, was a woman I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen her in person for over 4 years. Victoria Chen, Mark's ex-wife, was perched comfortably in my kitchen as if she belonged there, a glass of wine in her hand that I was fairly certain came from the bottle Mark and I had been saving for our anniversary next month. She was just as beautiful as I remembered from the few photographs I had seen, with long black hair that fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and the kind of effortless style that came from working in real estate and needing to look polished for clients every day. Mark was leaning against our kitchen counter, his own wine glass in hand, and when he saw me, his expression shifted into something I had never seen before. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of resigned defiance. Like someone who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong but had decided they didn't care about the consequences. Victoria turned to look at me with a smile that was perfectly pleasant on the surface but somehow managed to convey a message that made my stomach drop. It was the smile of someone who knew something I didn't. Someone who felt confident in their position in a game I hadn't even realized we were playing. "Rachel," Mark said, and his voice sounded different, more formal than it had been that morning when he mumbled goodbye over his coffee. Vicky stopped by to discuss some paperwork related to the divorce settlement. Apparently there were some loose ends that never got properly handled. He said this as if it explained everything, as if it was perfectly normal for ex-wives to show up unannounced at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night to handle paperwork that had supposedly been finalized 4 years ago. Victoria's smile widened slightly, and she took a sip of wine before speaking. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Rachel," she said, her voice smooth and confident in a way that suggested she didn't actually care whether I minded or not. "Mark was just explaining how busy you've been with work lately. It sounds like you're really dedicated to your career." There was something in the way she said it that made it sound like an insult disguised as a compliment, as if being dedicated to my career was somehow a character flaw, rather than something to be proud of. I stood there in my own kitchen, still holding my keys, feeling like an intruder in my own home. The dynamic in the room was all wrong, with Mark and Victoria positioned comfortably while I remained standing awkwardly by the entrance, but I couldn't figure out how to change it without seeming rude or paranoid. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual even though something was screaming inside my chest that this situation was not what it appeared to be. Mark and Victoria exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction of a second too long, the kind of look that passes between people who share a history and an understanding that excludes everyone else in the room. Mark cleared his throat and gestured vaguely toward some papers that were spread out on the kitchen island next to Victoria's wine glass. "Just some property stuff," he said. "You know how complicated these things can get. Vicky's been having some issues with her current living situation, and we were discussing whether it might make sense for her to stay in the guest room for a few weeks while she figures things out." The words hit me like ice water. Stay in the guest room. In our house. The house that Mark and I had bought together, that we had spent countless weekends renovating, that held 4 years of our shared life in every carefully chosen paint color, and every piece of furniture we had saved up to buy. I looked at Victoria, who was watching my reaction with what appeared to be genuine interest, as if she was curious to see how I would handle this information. "Stay here," I repeated, because I needed to make sure I had heard correctly. "For a few weeks?" Mark nodded, as if this was a perfectly reasonable request. As if inviting your ex-wife to move into the home you shared with your current wife was the kind of favor any decent person would extend. "It's just temporary," he said. "Vicky's lease ended unexpectedly, and she's between places right now. You know how tight the rental market is in Riverside? She just needs a little time to find something suitable." Victoria nodded sympathetically, as if she was grateful for Mark's generosity, but would completely understand if I objected. "I told Mark one could look into extended stay hotels," she said, "but he insisted that would be unnecessarily expensive when you have a perfectly good guest room that's just sitting empty." She said this as if she was being considerate of our finances, as if she was thinking about what was best for our household budget. The whole conversation felt surreal, like I had walked into someone else's life where the rules of normal social interaction didn't apply. In what universe was it appropriate for a husband to invite his ex-wife to move into the home he shared with his current wife without discussing it with that wife first? In what universe was it normal for an ex-wife to accept such an invitation without considering how awkward and inappropriate it would be for everyone involved? I looked around our kitchen, taking in the details that suddenly felt precious and threatened. The coffee maker that Mark had surprised me with last Christmas. The herb garden I had started on the windowsill above the sink. The refrigerator covered with takeout menus, appointment reminders, and photos from our last vacation to the coast. This was our space, our life, our carefully constructed sanctuary from the outside world. The idea of Victoria moving through these rooms, using our bathroom, eating meals at our table, felt like a violation I couldn't articulate without sounding jealous or petty. "How long have you two been discussing this?" I asked, trying to understand the timeline of how this decision had been made without my input. Mark shifted uncomfortably, and Victoria answered before he could speak. "Oh, we've been in touch for a few weeks now," she said casually. "Ever since my housing situation became complicated. Mark has been so helpful, really going above and beyond to make sure I have options." A few weeks. They had been talking for a few weeks, and Mark had never mentioned it to me. Not once in our morning conversations over coffee, not during our evening debriefs about our respective days, not during the lazy weekend moments when we usually shared whatever was on our minds. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. "I think I need to process this," I said finally, because I couldn't trust myself to say anything else without losing control of my emotions in front of Victoria. "This is a big decision, and I'd like to discuss it privately with Mark before we commit to anything." Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something harder underneath the polished exterior. "Of course," she said, standing up from the bar stool with fluid grace. "I completely understand. This is your home, and you should be comfortable with any arrangement." She gathered the papers from the kitchen island and slipped them into an expensive-looking leather portfolio. "I'll let you two talk it over. Mark has my number if you decide you're okay with helping me out." She moved toward Mark and placed her hand briefly on his arm in a gesture that was either completely innocent or deliberately intimate. "Thanks for the wine and for being such a good friend during a difficult time." Mark walked her to the front door, and I heard them talking quietly in the entryway, their voices too low for me to make out the words. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter and trying to make sense of what had just happened. When Mark returned, he looked defensive before I had even said anything, which told me everything I needed to know about how he viewed the situation. "Before you get upset," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not upset," I said, which was technically true because upset felt too small a word for the combination of confusion, betrayal, and fear that was churning in my stomach. "I'm trying to understand why you would make this kind of decision without talking to me first. This is our home, Mark. Our space. Decisions about who lives here should be made together." Mark ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time when he didn't want to answer a question directly. "It's not a big deal, Rachel," he said. "It's just a few weeks, and she's my ex-wife, not some random stranger. I thought you'd be okay with helping someone we know who's going through a tough time." The way he said, "someone we know," struck me as odd, because Victoria wasn't someone we knew together. She was someone from Mark's past, someone who had been absent from our life for 4 years, someone I had never had a real conversation with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Till tonight. The fact that Mark was characterizing her as someone we know suggested a level of ongoing connection that I hadn't been aware of. "When you say you've been talking for a few weeks," I said carefully, "what exactly does that mean? How did she even know to contact you about her housing situation?" Mark's expression shifted again, and I could see him calculating how much truth he wanted to share. "She called me when her lease situation got complicated," he said. "I guess she needed advice about rental law or something, and she remembered that I work in construction, so I might know about property management issues." This explanation felt thin, but I didn't have enough information to challenge it effectively. I was operating from a position of ignorance, trying to piece together a picture from fragments while Mark clearly had access to the whole story. And in these conversations about rental law, I continued, how did we get from legal advice to her moving into our guest room? Mark looked genuinely uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from one foot to the other and avoiding my eyes. Look, she's going through a divorce, he said finally. Her new husband turned out to be a complete disaster, and she's trying to rebuild her life. I felt bad for her, okay? She helped me through a tough time when we were married, and I thought maybe I could return the favor. This was the first I had heard about Victoria going through another divorce. In the 4 years that Mark and I had been together after his divorce was finalized, he had rarely mentioned Victoria except in passing references to paperwork or logistical details. I had assumed she had moved on completely, that she was living her own life somewhere else without any connection to ours. So she's getting divorced again, I said, trying to process this new information. And she thought the best solution was to move in with her previous ex-husband and his current wife. Mark winced at the way I phrased it, but he didn't contradict the basic facts. When you put it like that, it sounds weird, he admitted. But it's not like that. She's just a friend who needs help, and we have the space. I thought you'd be more understanding. There it was. The subtle shift that put the blame on me for being unreasonable, rather than on him for making a unilateral decision about our shared living space. I had seen this pattern before in our marriage, though usually around much smaller issues. Mark would make a choice that affected both of us, and when I questioned it, he would frame my questions as evidence that I was being difficult or unsupportive, rather than acknowledging that he should have consulted me in the first place. I need some time to think about this, I said, because I could feel the conversation spiraling in a direction that wouldn't be productive. Can you give me until tomorrow night to process everything before we give her an answer? Mark looked relieved that I wasn't demanding an immediate refusal, which probably should have been another red flag. Sure, he said. Take all the time you need. I think once you get used to the idea, you'll see that it's really not a big deal. Vicky's easy to live with, and she'll probably be gone before we even notice she's here. The way he said easy to live with suggested a familiarity with Victoria's living habits that seemed inconsistent with a marriage that had ended 4 years ago. But I was too emotionally exhausted to pursue that line of questioning right then. I needed space to think, to talk to Amanda, to figure out why every instinct I had was screaming that this arrangement was a terrible idea. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Mark slept peacefully beside me, apparently unburdened by any concerns about the situation he had created. I replayed the evening over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, every look that had passed between Mark and Victoria. There had been an ease between them that spoke of recent contact, of conversations I hadn't been privy to, of a relationship that had clearly not ended as completely as I had believed. The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. How had Victoria known our home phone number when she called about rental law? How had a few weeks of conversations about legal advice evolved into detailed discussions about our guest room and our household routines? Why had Mark been so certain I would agree to this arrangement that he had apparently already committed to it before discussing it with me? I thought about calling Amanda, but it was past midnight and I knew she had an early shift at the hospital the next morning. I thought about calling my mother, Linda Hayes, but I could already imagine her response. She would tell me to be a supportive wife, to trust Mark's judgment, to remember that marriage required compromise and understanding. My mother had always believed that women should accommodate their husbands' decisions, even when those decisions felt uncomfortable or unfair. My father, Robert Hayes, would probably just tell me to talk it through with Mark and trust that everything would work out for the best. Neither of my parents had ever been good at understanding situations that required setting boundaries or standing up for yourself when someone was asking too much. By morning, I had convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this really was just a temporary favor for someone going through a difficult time. Maybe my discomfort was rooted in jealousy or insecurity rather than legitimate concerns about boundaries and communication. Mark seemed so confident that this was a normal, helpful thing to do, and I had always trusted his judgment about people and situations. When he brought me coffee in bed before leaving for work, he seemed more like his usual self, chatting about his construction projects and asking about my presentation the day before, as if the conversation with Victoria had been just a minor blip in our otherwise normal routine. "I'm glad you're being so understanding about Vicky," he said as he kissed me goodbye. "I knew you'd come around once you had time to think about it. You're always so good about helping people who need it." The way he phrased it made it sound like the decision had already been made, like my night of consideration had been just a formality, rather than a genuine opportunity to weigh in on something that would affect our daily life. But I didn't want to start the day with another difficult conversation, so I just smiled and told him to have a good day at work. I spent most of that Thursday distracted at the office, going through the motions of my normal responsibilities, while my mind churned through the implications of Victoria moving into our guest room. During my lunch break, I finally called Amanda and told her about the previous evening's conversation. Her response was immediate and unambiguous. "Are you kidding me?" she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "He wants his ex-wife to move into your house, and he didn't ask you first?" "Rachel, that's completely inappropriate. There's no universe in which that's a normal favor to ask of your current wife." Hearing Amanda's reaction validated my own instincts, but it also made me realize how far I had been willing to bend my own sense of what was reasonable in order to avoid conflict with Mark. "He says it's just temporary," I said weakly, "and that she's going through a tough divorce." Amanda made a sound of frustration that I could hear clearly through the phone. "Rachel, listen to yourself. You're making excuses for him, and this isn't the kind of situation that should require excuses. If Victoria is going through a tough time, there are dozens of ways Mark could help her that don't involve her moving into your shared living space. He could help her find a rental, or loan her money for a security deposit, or connect her with other friends who might have space available. The fact that his first solution was to invite her into your home suggests that this isn't really about helping her with a housing crisis." Amanda's words hit me like a splash of cold water, forcing me to confront the possibility that Mark's motivations weren't as altruistic as he had presented them. "What are you saying?" I asked, even though part of me already knew what she was going to say. "I'm saying that healthy boundaries in a marriage don't include inviting ex-spouses to move in without extensive discussion and mutual agreement. I'm saying that if Mark was truly committed to his marriage with you, he would have immediately recognized why this request was inappropriate and found another way to help Victoria. And I'm saying that you need to trust your instincts here, because your instincts are telling you that something is wrong." Amanda paused for a moment, and when she continued, her voice was gentler but no less serious. "Rachel, you're one of the smartest, most intuitive people I know. If this situation feels wrong to you, there's probably a good reason for that. Don't let Mark convince you that your reasonable concerns are evidence of jealousy or insecurity." That evening, I came home determined to have a clear, honest conversation with Mark about boundaries and expectations. But when I walked through the front door, I could hear voices in the living room, and my heart sank as I realized that Victoria was already there again. This time, she wasn't just visiting to discuss paperwork. She was sitting on our couch with what appeared to be several suitcases and boxes arranged around her feet, as if she had already moved in and was just waiting for me to acknowledge the reality of the situation. "Rachel!" Mark called out cheerfully when he heard me come in. "Perfect timing. Vicky's landlord gave her notice today that she needs to be out by tomorrow, so we figured it would be easier if she just moved in tonight rather than scrambling to find a hotel at the last minute." He said this as if it was a natural development, as if the timeline had been compressed by external circumstances rather than by his own choices. Victoria stood up from the couch and smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "I hope this is okay," she said. "I know it's sudden, but I promise I'll be the perfect houseguest. You won't even know I'm here." As she spoke, I noticed that she was already dressed comfortably, in jeans and a soft sweater, as if she had already settled into the casual intimacy of shared living space. Her suitcases weren't the kind of hastily packed bags someone would throw together in an emergency. They were matching luggage, carefully organized, as if she had been planning this move for more than just the few hours since her supposed eviction notice. "Mark," I said carefully, "could I talk to you privately for a moment?" He looked annoyed by the request, but he followed me into the kitchen while Victoria remained in the living room, presumably unpacking her belongings into our guest room. "I thought we agreed to discuss this decision together before giving Victoria an answer," I said, keeping my voice low so she wouldn't overhear. Mark's expression hardened in a way that was becoming familiar but still felt jarring. "We did discuss it," he said. "Last night. And you said you needed time to think about it, which I gave you. But then Vicky's situation became urgent, and I had to make a quick decision. What was I supposed to do? Let her sleep in her car? Because you needed more time to process. The way he framed it made me sound selfish and indecisive, as if my request for a day to consider a major change to our living situation had been unreasonable. It also ignored the fact that I had never actually agreed to anything, only said that I needed time to think. Mark, this isn't about processing or being indecisive. This is about making major decisions about our home together, as partners. The fact that Victoria's timeline became compressed doesn't change the fact that this affects both of us, and should be discussed by both of us. Mark sighed heavily, as if I was being deliberately difficult about something that should be simple. Look, she's already here, he said. Her stuff is here, she doesn't have anywhere else to go tonight, and it's just for a few weeks. Can we please just move forward and figure out the details as we go? There it was again. The assumption that forward movement meant accepting the situation he had created, rather than reconsidering whether the situation was appropriate in the first place. I felt trapped between looking like a terrible person who would kick someone out onto the street and standing up for my own right to have input into major decisions about my own home. Fine, I said finally, because I couldn't see a way to reverse what had already been set in motion without causing a scene that would be humiliating for everyone involved. But we need to establish some clear boundaries and expectations, and we need to have a definite timeline for when this arrangement will end. Mark's relief was visible, and he reached over to squeeze my shoulder in what was probably meant to be a gesture of gratitude and affection. Thank you, he said. I knew you'd be understanding once you saw how much Vicky really needed our help. This is going to work out fine, you'll see. But as I watched him return to the living room to help Victoria settle in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just agreed to something that would change everything about my marriage and my sense of security in my own home. And as Victoria looked up at me with that same perfectly pleasant smile that somehow managed to convey a message I couldn't quite decode, I realized that I was about to find out exactly what that change would look like. The first week of living with Victoria felt like trying to navigate a minefield, while pretending everything was perfectly normal. She had indeed settled into our guest room with an efficiency that suggested she had done this before, transforming the space I had carefully decorated as a cozy retreat for visiting family into what looked like a temporary but well-appointed studio apartment. Her belongings somehow managed to sprawl beyond the guest room boundaries despite her promises to keep a minimal footprint. Designer toiletries appeared in our main bathroom. Expensive skincare products lined up next to my drugstore moisturizer like a not-so-subtle comparison. Her coffee pods took up residence next to our regular ground coffee, and somehow the kitchen always smelled like her perfume in the mornings, a scent that was lovely but distinctly not mine in my own space. What bothered me more than the physical encroachment was the way Victoria seemed to know exactly how to navigate our household routines, as if she had been studying them. She knew that Mark liked his coffee black and strong, and she had it ready for him every morning before he came downstairs. She knew that he preferred to watch the news during breakfast, and she would have the television tuned to his favorite local station, with the volume set exactly where he liked it. She knew that he had a habit of leaving his work boots by the back door, and she would move them to the mudroom closet without being asked, as if she was naturally tidier and more considerate than I was. These small acts of thoughtfulness might have seemed innocent to an outside observer, but they felt calculated to me, designed to demonstrate how seamlessly she could integrate into the life Mark and I had built together. The morning routine became particularly uncomfortable because Victoria was an early riser who seemed to relish having quiet time alone with Mark before I got up for work. I would come downstairs to find them sitting at the kitchen island, coffee cups in hand, talking quietly about topics that somehow always seemed to shift when I entered the room. They would look up with bright smiles and include me in whatever conversation they were having, but there was always a sense that I was interrupting something more intimate and substantial. Mark would update me on construction projects I had heard about dozens of times, or Victoria would ask polite questions about my work that felt more like social obligation than genuine interest. The easy camaraderie I used to enjoy with Mark during our morning coffee felt strained and performative, as if we were all playing roles in a domestic drama where no one had given me the script. Victoria's presence also changed the way Mark behaved in subtle ways that I couldn't quite articulate but definitely felt. He was more animated during conversations, more attentive to details about household management, more interested in cooking elaborate dinners that showcased his culinary skills. When it was just the two of us, Mark had been content with simple meals and quiet evenings. But with Victoria in the house, he seemed energized by the opportunity to demonstrate his competence as a host and provider. He would spend an hour preparing meals that he could have thrown together in 15 minutes, carefully plating everything and opening wine to accompany dinner as if we were entertaining honored guests rather than just getting through a weeknight meal. Victoria always praised his efforts enthusiastically, commenting on seasoning choices and presentation techniques with the kind of detailed appreciation that made it clear she understood cooking in a way that I honestly didn't. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home, watching my husband perform a version of himself that was more polished and engaging than the man I had been married to for 6 years. This wasn't necessarily a bad version of Mark, but it was a version that apparently required Victoria's presence to emerge, which raised uncomfortable questions about what our marriage had been missing and why he had never seemed motivated to bring this level of energy and attention to our daily life together. When I mentioned to Mark that he seemed different since Victoria had moved in, he brushed off my observation with a laugh and said that having a houseguest just made him more conscious of wanting to make a good impression. But the explanation felt insufficient because I was his wife, not a houseguest, and the implication that he needed to make a good impression on Victoria but not on me was more hurtful than I think he realized. The weekend brought new challenges because Victoria didn't disappear into her room or make herself scarce the way a temporary houseguest might be expected to do. Instead, she treated Saturday and Sunday as opportunities to integrate even more fully into our household routines. She joined us for grocery shopping trips, offering suggestions about meal planning and store navigation with the confidence of someone who belonged in our domestic decision-making process. She knew which brands Mark preferred and which products we usually bought, knowledge that seemed to come from conversations I hadn't been part of rather than from observation during her brief time in our house. At the grocery store, other shoppers probably assumed we were all family or close friends running errands together. And the cashier even commented on how nice it was to see such a harmonious group doing their shopping together. The whole experience felt surreal, as if I was watching someone else live my life while I tagged along as an observer. Victoria also had opinions about home improvement projects that Mark had been considering, and she seemed remarkably well informed about the specific challenges and opportunities of our house. She knew that the upstairs bathroom had a persistent leak that Mark had been meaning to address, and she had researched contractors who specialized in the kind of plumbing work that would be required. She knew that we had been thinking about refinishing the hardwood floors in the living room, and she had found examples of stain colors that would complement our existing furniture and decor. Her suggestions were invariably practical and well-researched, which made it difficult to object to her input without seeming petty or territorial. But the fact that she was making suggestions at all felt like an assumption of permanence that contradicted the temporary nature of her stay. Mark seemed delighted by Victoria's interest in our home improvement projects, and he spent hours discussing possibilities and timelines with her in a way that felt more collaborative and enthusiastic than conversations we had ever had about the same topics. When I tried to join these discussions, I found myself lacking the technical knowledge and research that Victoria brought to every conversation. She had looked up permit requirements and cost estimates and timeline considerations, while I had just been vaguely aware that Mark wanted to tackle these projects eventually. My contributions to the conversations felt superficial and uninformed compared to the detailed planning that Mark and Victoria were able to engage in together. I began to wonder if this was how Mark preferred to make decisions about our shared living space, with someone who matched his level of interest and expertise, rather than someone who was content to trust his judgment and provide general support. The most uncomfortable moment of that first weekend came when we were all in the living room on Sunday evening, ostensibly watching a movie but really just coexisting in the same space, in a way that felt increasingly awkward to me. Victoria was curled up on one end of our sectional sofa, wearing comfortable clothes that made it clear she felt completely at home, while Mark sat in the middle and I occupied the other end. During a commercial break, Victoria's phone rang and she glanced at the screen before declining the call with a frustrated sigh. "Ex-husband troubles?" Mark asked with what sounded like genuine concern and familiarity with her situation. Victoria nodded and made a face that conveyed both annoyance and resignation. He's being completely unreasonable about the property settlement, she said. He wants to keep the house we bought together, but he also wants me to be responsible for half the mortgage payments even after I move out. It's like he thinks he can have everything both ways. Mark made sympathetic noises and asked follow-up questions about the legal situation, and Victoria launched into a detailed explanation of her divorce proceedings that revealed just how much she and Mark had been discussing her personal situation. She talked about her ex-husband's business finances, about custody arrangements for assets, about her lawyer's strategy for the settlement negotiations. The level of detail suggested that this wasn't the first time she had explained these circumstances to Mark, and his informed follow-up questions made it clear that he had been following the situation closely. What struck me most about this conversation was how naturally it flowed between them, as if they had been discussing Victoria's divorce for weeks or months, rather than just since her housing crisis had emerged. Mark seemed to know the names of her lawyer and her ex-husband's business partners. He was familiar with the timeline of court dates and mediation sessions. He had opinions about her legal strategy that suggested he had been thinking about her situation in depth and detail. Meanwhile, I sat on my own couch feeling like an outsider listening to two people discuss a shared concern that I had no part in. The intimacy of the conversation wasn't romantic, but it was the kind of intimacy that comes from ongoing emotional support and detailed knowledge of someone's private struggles. It was the kind of intimacy that I thought Mark and I shared exclusively, but apparently I had been wrong about that. After Victoria went to bed that night, I tried to talk to Mark about how strange it felt to discover that he had been so involved in his ex-wife's current divorce proceedings. I asked him how long they had been discussing her legal situation and when these conversations were taking place, and why he had never mentioned to me that he was providing emotional support to Victoria during her marriage crisis. Mark's response was defensive in a way that immediately put me on edge. She needed someone to talk to, he said, as if this explained everything. Her divorce is complicated, and she doesn't have a lot of people she can trust with the details. I've been through a divorce myself, so I understand what she's going through better than most people would. This explanation might have been reasonable if Victoria was a close friend or family member, but she was Mark's ex-wife, someone who had been completely absent from our life until 2 weeks ago. The idea that Mark was now serving as her primary emotional support during her current divorce raised questions about boundaries and priorities that I wasn't sure how to articulate without sounding jealous or controlling. When are these conversations happening? I asked, because I was trying to understand the logistics of how they had developed such detailed knowledge of each other's situations. Mark looked uncomfortable with the question, which told me that the answer was probably something I wouldn't like. She calls sometimes when she's having a hard day, he said. Usually during my lunch break or in the evening when you're working late or out with Amanda. It's not like we're scheduling regular phone dates or anything. She just needs someone to listen when things get overwhelming. The fact that Victoria was calling Mark during times when I wasn't around suggested a level of intentionality that contradicted the casual, spontaneous nature of the support he was describing. It also meant that Mark had been having regular phone conversations with his ex-wife for weeks without mentioning it to me, which felt like a significant omission regardless of the content of those conversations. Mark, I need you to understand why this feels weird to me, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. Victoria was your wife for 3 years. You two shared a life together, and then you got divorced and moved on. Now she's going through another divorce, and instead of turning to current friends or family or a therapist, she's turned to you for emotional support. Meanwhile, she's also living in our house because of a housing crisis that somehow couldn't be solved in any other way. Don't you see how this creates a situation where your ex-wife is becoming increasingly central to our daily life? Mark listened to this explanation with an expression that suggested he thought I was making the situation more complicated than it needed to be. Rachel, you're overthinking this, he said. Vicky and I have history, yes, but we're friends now, that's all. She's going through a tough time, and I'm helping her the way I would help any friend who needed support. The fact that we used to be married doesn't change the basic human decency of helping someone when they're struggling. But the problem was that Victoria wasn't just any friend. She was someone who had shared intimate knowledge of Mark's habits and preferences and emotional patterns. She was someone who had been married to him during his late 20s, which meant she had known him during a formative period of his adult life. She was someone who could slip seamlessly into our household routines because she understood how Mark liked to live in ways that came from years of shared domestic life, rather than casual friendship. I tried to explain these concerns to Mark, but he seemed genuinely baffled by my discomfort. From his perspective, he was being a good person by helping someone in need, and my concerns about boundaries and appropriate relationships were evidence that I was insecure, rather than evidence that the situation itself was problematic. The conversation ended with both of us feeling frustrated and misunderstood, and I went to bed that night with the sinking realization that Mark and I had fundamentally different ideas about what was appropriate behavior in a marriage. The second week of Victoria's stay brought new developments that made me even more uncomfortable. She had apparently decided that her temporary residence in our guest room entitled her to contribute opinions about our social plans and household decisions. When Amanda called to invite me out for dinner on Thursday night, Victoria overheard the conversation and suggested that maybe it would be more fun to host a dinner party at our house instead, since we had such a lovely dining room and kitchen that seemed perfect for entertaining. She offered to help with the cooking and planning, turning my simple dinner date with my best friend into a more elaborate social event that would center around our house and include Victoria as a co-host. Mark thought this was a wonderful idea, and he was so enthusiastic about showing off his cooking skills and our home that I found myself agreeing to the plan, even though it felt like Victoria was gradually taking over the planning of my social life. The dinner party itself was a study in subtle psychological warfare, disguised as gracious hospitality. Victoria had spent the afternoon helping Mark prepare an elaborate menu that showcased dishes I had never seen him make before. She seemed to know exactly which pots and pans to use for each recipe, where to find serving dishes and utensils that I had forgotten we owned, how to arrange flowers from our garden in combinations that looked professionally designed. When Amanda arrived, Victoria greeted her at the door as if she was a co-host, rather than a temporary house guest, and she spent the evening demonstrating an intimate knowledge of our home and our possessions that made it seem like she had been living there for years rather than weeks. Amanda's reaction to Victoria was polite but wary, and I could see her taking mental notes about the dynamic between Victoria, Mark, and me. During a moment when Victoria was in the kitchen and Mark was opening wine, Amanda leaned over to me and whispered, "How long is she planning to stay?" The question I had been asking myself for 2 weeks, but I realized I didn't have a good answer, because every time I brought up timelines with Mark, he deflected the conversation by talking about Victoria's ongoing legal complications and housing search challenges. The most unsettling part of the dinner party was watching Mark and Victoria work together in the kitchen, with a coordination that spoke of shared experience and natural rhythm. They moved around each other easily, anticipating each other's needs and finishing each other's sentences about cooking techniques and timing. They shared inside jokes about kitchen disasters and restaurant experiences that clearly predated their divorce, and they had a comfortable familiarity that made me feel like an outsider in my own kitchen. When Amanda complimented the meal, Victoria and Mark accepted the praise as a team, with Victoria giving Mark credit for the more complex dishes, and Mark acknowledging Victoria's contributions to the planning and presentation. I sat at my own dining room table, eating food prepared in my own kitchen, feeling like a guest at someone else's dinner party. After Amanda left that night, she lingered on our front porch to talk to me privately while Victoria and Mark cleaned up inside. Her expression was serious, and she didn't waste time with diplomatic language. "Rachel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," she said. "Are you okay with this arrangement? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Mark's ex-wife is gradually taking over your house and your husband, and you're being way too polite about it." Amanda's directness was exactly what I needed to hear, because it validated concerns I had been trying to talk myself out of for 2 weeks. "I don't know," I admitted. "Mark keeps saying it's temporary, and that I'm overthinking things, but it doesn't feel temporary. It feels like Victoria is settling in for the long haul, and Mark is encouraging it instead of setting boundaries." Amanda nodded grimly, and I could see that she had reached the same conclusion from observing our interactions during dinner. "Rachel, I've been your best friend for over 10 years, and I've never seen you this uncomfortable in your own home," she said. "You were barely participating in conversations at your own dinner party. You looked like you were afraid to express opinions about food or decorating or anything else, because Victoria and Mark had already established themselves as the experts on everything. That's not normal, and it's not sustainable." She paused for a moment, looking back toward the house where I could hear Mark and Victoria laughing about something in the kitchen. "I think you need to seriously consider the possibility that this arrangement isn't really about helping Victoria with a housing crisis. I think there's something else going on here, and you deserve to know what it is." That night, I lay awake thinking about Amanda's words and trying to figure out how to address my growing concerns without seeming paranoid or controlling. The problem was that I didn't have concrete evidence of anything inappropriate happening. Mark and Victoria weren't being physically affectionate or obviously romantic. They weren't sneaking around or lying about their interactions. But there was an emotional intimacy between them that felt like it was crowding out the emotional intimacy in my marriage, and I didn't know how to object to that without sounding like I was jealous of their friendship. The next morning brought a development that crystallized all of my concerns into a single, devastating moment of clarity. I came downstairs earlier than usual because I had an early meeting at work, and I found Mark and Victoria in the kitchen having what was clearly a serious conversation. They were sitting close together at the kitchen island, Victoria's hand resting on Mark's arm in a gesture that looked comforting and intimate. When they saw me, they immediately separated and shifted into bright, casual conversation about coffee and weather. But the transition was too quick and too obvious to be natural. "Everything okay?" I asked, because the atmosphere in the room felt heavy with whatever they had been discussing before I interrupted. Mark and Victoria exchanged a quick look that lasted just long enough to be noticeable. "Victoria's lawyer called yesterday with some updates about her divorce," Mark said. "Some complications with the settlement that are going to delay things longer than she hoped." Victoria nodded and gave me a smile that was supposed to be reassuring but somehow felt like a challenge. "I'm afraid I might need to impose on your hospitality a little longer than we originally planned," she said. "My ex-husband is being particularly difficult about the timeline, and it's going to take more time to resolve everything than I expected." She said this as if she was apologizing for an inconvenience, but there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't particularly sorry about the extended timeline. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to acknowledge that this change in plans was something we needed to discuss privately before agreeing to anything. But instead of suggesting that we needed to talk it over, he immediately launched into reassurances that Victoria was welcome to stay as long as she needed, that we understood how complicated divorce proceedings could be, that she shouldn't worry about imposing because we were happy to help. He spoke as if he was representing both of us in this decision, as if my agreement was assumed rather than requested. "How much longer are we talking about?" I asked, because I needed some kind of timeline to anchor my expectations. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something that looked almost like satisfaction before she resumed her apologetic demeanor. "It's hard to say exactly," she said. "These things can drag on for months when one party is being uncooperative. I'm hoping it won't be more than a few more weeks. But honestly, it could be longer. A few more weeks that could be longer." What had started as a temporary favor for someone in crisis was now an open-ended living arrangement with no clear conclusion date. And Mark was nodding along as if this was a perfectly reasonable development that required no further discussion. "We'll figure it out as we go," Mark said, reaching over to squeeze my hand in what was probably meant to be a gesture of solidarity, but felt more like an attempt to forestall any objections I might have. "The important thing is that Vicky has a safe, stable place to stay while she gets her life sorted out." The casual way he called her Vicky, the intimacy of the nickname, the assumption that her stability was our responsibility, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that this decision affected me too. All of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity about what was actually happening in my marriage. Victoria wasn't just staying in our guest room. She was moving into our life, into our relationship, into the space that Mark and I had built together. And Mark wasn't just helping an old friend through a crisis. He was choosing Victoria's comfort and stability over my comfort and concerns, choosing to prioritize her needs over our marriage, choosing to make unilateral decisions about our shared life because he knew I would be too polite and too accommodating to make a scene about it. As I sat in my car outside Creative Solutions' marketing agency that morning, I realized that I had two choices. I could continue being understanding and supportive and accommodating while Victoria gradually took over more and more of my life and my marriage. Or I could start fighting for what was mine, even if that meant risking conflict and confrontation, and the possibility that Mark would choose Victoria over me when forced to make a choice. The thought of confrontation terrified me, because I had spent 6 years of marriage avoiding serious conflict with Mark, trusting that our love and commitment would be enough to navigate any challenges that arose. But sitting in that parking lot, watching other people walk into their jobs with the confidence that comes from knowing your personal life is stable and secure, I realized that avoiding conflict had only worked as long as no one was actively threatening the foundation of our relationship. Now that someone was, my strategy of accommodation and understanding was proving to be completely inadequate to protect what I had thought was mine. I spent that entire workday distracted and anxious, going through the motions of my responsibilities while my mind raced through possible scenarios and solutions. I thought about calling my mother, but I knew she would tell me to be patient and supportive, and to trust that Mark had good intentions. I thought about calling a marriage counselor, but that would require Mark's participation, and I wasn't sure he would agree to go or take it seriously if he did. I thought about confronting Victoria directly, but I didn't know what I would say or what I hoped to accomplish. By the time I left work that evening, I had reached a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to stop being polite about this situation. I was going to stop accommodating Mark's decisions and Victoria's presence and the gradual erosion of my own comfort and security in my own home. I was going to start asking direct questions and demanding clear answers and setting boundaries that protected my marriage and my sanity, even if that meant risking the peace and harmony that had been so important to me. But when I walked through our front door that evening, I discovered that Victoria had already moved beyond subtle psychological manipulation into something much more direct and devastating. She was in my kitchen, wearing my apron, cooking dinner with ingredients I had bought and supplies I had organized, as if she was the woman of the house and I was the temporary guest who might or might not be invited to stay for dinner. And when she looked up at me with that perfectly pleasant smile and said, "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to surprise Mark with his favorite meal since he's been so stressed about work lately," I realized that the time for polite accommodation was over. The war for my marriage was about to begin, and I was already losing ground I hadn't even realized was under attack. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.